Mikey Kay, former RAF pilot and investigative journalist, joins us live from Paris. Good evening to you. What is your assessment of how safe or how risky the Boeing 737 MAX 8 is?
I think when we're talking about the term unsafe, in aviation terms, I think the professionals would use the term risk, and risk is probability versus consequence. And I think that's how the progress or the forward decision-making going on beyond the Ethiopian Airlines crash, the 737 MAX 8 crash, should be assessed. It should be through a process of delicate risk assessment. And what do I mean by that? I mean that as it stands right now, there is limited evidence as to what actually happened to the Ethiopian Airlines crash coming out of Addis Ababa en route to Nairobi. The two black boxes, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, have been recovered. And the latest reporting on the data assimilation of those two boxes is that the Ethiopians don't have the technology or the best technology to actually gain that data, and they're going to send it out of the country for that data to be analyzed. Probably, I would suggest, to the United States, the NTSB, who have all the technology to be able to gain the data from these two black boxes as quickly as possible. So I think when we're talking about, is the aircraft safe to fly based on what countries are deciding to ground it? So the UK has decided to ground it, Australia has, China has. There are many, many countries that have taken the precautionary measure to ground the 737 MAX 8. But the United States has decided not to do that. The FAA has decided that it isn't going, at the moment, to ground those aircraft.
All right, so then what then do you think is holding the FAA back?
Why the FAA might be making this decision, I think, is the most interesting question. If I was part of the investigation team, or I was the CEO of a major airline that was trying to understand the risk as to whether to ground the aircraft or not, and obviously that is determined by the FAA or the CAA or whatever air operating authority it is, I would be looking at the previous information and evidence that came from the Lion Air crash in October 2018, and the conclusions of that. And those conclusions, if I can just sort of briefly go through what the conclusions were, was it was effectively a problem with the angle of attack sensors on the new aircraft. What is angle of attack? Well, this is called the leading edge of a wing, and this is called the trailing edge of the wing. And the line between these two and the line between the forward airflow, this angle here is called the angle of attack. And that's really important in aviation, because as the angle of attack increases, the potential for the airspeed to decrease if the throttle isn't pushed forward, the power, is quite high. And as the airspeed decreases and the angle of attack increases, it brings the aircraft nearer to what's called a stall. And a stall is a catastrophic loss of lift. So what these sensors on the 737 MAX 8 do is they detect when this angle of attack and the airspeed is getting low, and they push that information into what's called an MCAS, which is a fancy name, Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, for a digital box that sends messages to the flight control system to push the nose forward. That's an automatic occurrence within the software and the equipment on this new type of 737. So what happened in the Lion Air crash was that you were getting erroneous messages from these angle of attack sensors when the actual angle of attack wasn't that high, which was forcing the aircraft to take a nose down or trim down attitude. And that's obviously at low altitude and at fairly high speeds. You know, that is an extremely dangerous situation for the crew to be in. The reason why this is all important, Molly, is because when that information came out, the FAA decided that it was going to issue an emergency airworthiness directive. And that came out in December 2018. And that basically advised Boeing to incorporate procedures and information about this erroneous occurrence into the operating manuals of all of the airlines that were operating the 737 MAX 8 and 9.
Why would Boeing not lay enough emphasis on system-specific training?
So where we're at, basically, is we're trying to understand how much of the airworthiness directive that ordered Boeing to incorporate procedures and protocols and information about these erroneous instances that were happening between the angle of attack sensors and the MCAS, how much of that information was A, included in the operating manuals, and B, was acted upon by the airlines and the operating authorities in terms of the training that the crews got about the actual software, the training and understanding that the crews got from the conclusions of the Lion Air crash, and I'd say most importantly, the opportunity for crews to act upon that information in an emergency environment in the simulator to practice that emergency. And so that is going to be different, I would suggest, from Southwest Airlines that operates it in the United States, through to Ethiopian Airlines that operate obviously in Ethiopia, and Indonesian Airlines, and all of these airlines that operate this particular type of 737 around the world. So going back to the initial question, how safe or unsafe is it? I would use all of that information to assess the risk depending on what action the airlines had taken based on the information that Boeing put into the operating manuals, if all the operating manuals of all the airlines had that information in it, and then how much time, energy and resource was put into training the crews up to try and understand and deal with that problem if it ever happened.
Thank you very much for that there, Mikey. That is Mikey K, a former RAF pilot and an investigative journalist joining us here on Wion.